Okay, so my first understanding of antinatalism honestly came from Reddit years ago. I don't know how exactly I got to the Reddit page where they were discussing antinatalism. I must have been looking up something relevant to the idea when on the app, like child free or nihilism. At the time, as a young woman at a childbearing age, seeing my peers pursue a family life and everyone being on Facebook congratulating the births of new people, I couldn't help but think about my place in the world. At the time, I was unemployed, depressed, and just skeptic about everything. So I tried to find some answers, just get an idea about what it meant to be child free, especially as a woman who, is supposed to aspire to having children. you know, would be would being child free be a virtuous route? And I was just amazed when I happened to get on the antinatalism page on Reddit. Changed my whole worldview. If you haven't been on the antinatalism universe on Reddit yet, I highly recommend you join the community. So, what is antinatalism? A simple Google search tells me antinatalism or antinatalism is the view that procreation is wrong. Antinatalists argue that humans should abstain from procreation because it is morally wrong. Emphasis on the procreation. Procreation can be simply defined as reproduction, so sex resulting in child is a no for us here in antinatalism land. The term I'm hearing on the streets was coined by David Benatar, a South African philosopher and author who is also a fellow Sagittarius. Hey, in his book Better to Have Never Been, he quote argues that coming into existence is always a serious harm. Although the good things in one's life make one's life go better than it otherwise would have gone, one could not have been deprived by their absence if one had not existed. Simply, the good things that make life great wouldn't be a problem to someone who wasn't coerced into existence. We argue that life is a gift because of all the wonderful things we can experience from being alive, but Benatar surmises that existence is harmful for many reasons, but simply because of non consent, suffering, and eventual death. To put things in a more digestible mode, Benatar provides a chart to provide a bit more clarity for his argument. In existing, there is more bad inherited as a result. The presence of pleasure is good to one who exists, but the presence of pain is bad as well to someone who exists. So the existing person experiences bad in existence is essentially the point. No matter how much pleasure they also are granted, they still deal with some bad things. Those that do not exist don't experience pain, which is good, and also do not experience pleasure, which is not bad. Emphasis on the not, because if one does not exist, there isn't necessarily a loss or a gain in experiencing anything at all. If anything, this chart shows that those that do not exist net more of a positive outcome because they never inherit the bad parts of existence in the first place. I hope that makes sense. So, the making of new people is what antinatalists like myself consider morally wrong. From understanding this fairly new concept, I discovered that this idea meant a couple things and didn't mean a lot of the daunting things many people were ready to make of it. On Reddit, there were people ready to combat antinatalists, arguing, well, if existence is so bad, why not consider suicide? What about the current babies and children? So, antinatalists obviously hate children, and if you're up to speed, you already know how to answer these things, but for clarity. Being an antinatalist doesn't mean that one hates life or that we all believe that we should no longer exist at this time. But from what I can gather, antinatalists do believe in harm reduction. And as we can see every day, humans produce harm to each other just from being alive, from trivial pursuits. Need I go on? Existence has shown us that we don't support human life well enough to take care of those here, so reproduction, the creating of new people, would be a harm to those new beings. No matter how many good things that being can experience, all the candy and amusement parks and whatever else we convince ourselves in saying this life is worth living, antinatalists also simply make the point that bringing life into the world is harmful because that would be subjecting that life to death, all of these things without that being's consent, having to traverse this life and make meaning of a world that is quick to dispose of them, and so on. But let me try to clear this question up real quickly. On the subject of suicide, and really this deserves a deep dive, but to be concise, antinatalists don't believe in suicide, or shouldn't, because we're already here. One compelling and worthwhile characteristic to being an antinatalist is that we value life, more particularly the quality of life. Suicide essentially would defeat the purpose of upholding the quality and sanctity of life in which we are advocating should be better to begin with. Antinatalists again want to reduce suffering and believe in a quality life where pain is mitigated. We're not trying to kill off the planet, but we do believe that the world should stop bringing people into a world that cannot foster a sense of quality in which every being deserves. To the second question, what about the kids here and now? Hopefully, the previous point answers it, but we should raise the current children of our world to be upstanding members of society. Obviously, now that they're in existence, no one is saying take them back, but it is maybe real to note that they're on the same playing field as everyone else, adults and all. Once babies are born, they're susceptible to all the ills this life brings. If we care enough about life and want a better future for our youth, it's imperative that in this lifetime, we do the best we can in creating a world for them to thrive, facilitating values so that there is a new future where suffering and harm is dramatically reduced in their lifetimes. We should have by now given these kids a cure or potion to death, but we haven't, so we're responsible for their demise. I mean, I'm not because I don't have any kids, but you get the point. We should have done our best before these new kids came into the world, and since we haven't, procreation is just giving fresh blood for the inevitable death we will all have to face. And to the last point about antinatalists generally hating kids or something, not necessarily true, and I can attest to that as a person who wanted kids myself, who felt and still feels somewhat maternal at heart. Adoption, fostering are options for myself and other antinatalists to consider. I don't hate kids, neither do a handful of antinatalists. We just believe that reproduction is wrong. And if there aren't more prevalent examples showing how natalists actually are the ones who may possibly hate kids, look at our foster systems filled with children without homes, and instead of these so-called lovers of kids to support the children in the foster system, they believe their genes are so marvelous or just wonderful that they must produce their own child. So yeah, no, antinatalists for the most part don't hate kids. As said before, we love life and wish to reduce harm, so antinatalists, while being against procreation, aren't exclusively child-free. Antinatalists can and still do adopt and foster as means of fulfilling their personal or parental desires. And we must not also forget that people with children can also be antinatalists. People that have already procreated can be antinatalists, so it is not exclusive to people who are biologically child-free. There are people that are antinatalists who have children of their own and can still adopt the antinatalist ideology with their own biological children. Those are just some of the main arguments people against antinatalism are ready to fire at us, but let me know of some of the other oppositions that you've heard of in the comments. Now, I want to get into some compelling thoughts regarding antinatalism from what I've learned through the internet, books, and so on that would be cool to consider or continue to consider now. I made a video about the controversy surrounding abortion before and mentioned in my rant that if one is to be pro-life, they must also be pro-death because life inhabits death inevitably. And I think that's a serious point proponents of life should consider. The irony of our everyday lives is that we do everything in our power to stay alive, working jobs that we hate, taking medications, etc. And yet all that work is all for naught. No matter one's prestige, resources, or optimism, death is looming around the corner. This life is rented, and it's really crazy how this world tells us we have ownership of our lives when we fundamentally do not. We had not a choice in arriving. The quality of our lives based on the constructions and circumstances of our modern world. Neither do we have much control of how we die, and it's even worse understanding that considering we live in a world riddled with disease and violence. Why bring life into a world where they will die, where they will have to fight to survive? It just truly doesn't make any sense. Life is death, and we need to drill that into the heads of people before they find that procreation is what they want to do. In Dr. Ken Coates' book, Anti-natalism, Rejectionist Philosophy from Buddhism to Benatar, there were so many wonderful points, but here are a few highlights. Around page 97, Coates references Arthur Schopenhauer, another notable philosopher. He says, "Is there not then a trade-off between pain and pleasure, the joys and sorrows of life?" This brings us to a complex series of arguments that Schopenhauer advances in defense of his viewpoint. First of all, he maintains that the pain and suffering involved in human existence far exceeds its pleasures. This is in part because we take normal well-being and satisfaction for granted and do not feel particularly joyful about it. I love this section because look around. The world is always in pursuit of more. We're never satisfied. Even though we've entered a digital age where we can connect with a variety of people online, we have services that attend to our every need, it's still not enough. Look at what's happening in Iran. The protests going on were sparked from a young woman being stoned to death because she didn't wear her hijab the right way. Or just look at what happened to Takeoff. And yes, I'm still mentioning him because I think some really demonic things are at play. But he and his crew go out to have a good time, and yet it's not enough. People have to bring guns and to kill innocent people. We take this life for granted. Instead of humanity to sit in satisfaction of our progress, we continue to create issues for ourselves, and we're never happy. As I've stated in previous videos, we've yet to reap from the so-called good we're doing. So this life is just a cyclical disaster that must be avoided at all costs. Another compelling part in the book is around page 112, but it kind of starts on page 111, so sorry I didn't get that in here, but where Coates highlights the guilt embedded in sex, he says, "For what is involved here is no less than the continuation of the species for which nature has programmed us." And then it goes on, as you can see at the top of the page, and it is the blind urge to exist and to propagate that stupefies us into accepting the illusion that to be a human individual is worthwhile. Thus, something that ought not to be continues its existence driven by the will to life. Put differently, man's life takes the form of a compulsory service that he is in duty bound to carry out. But who has contracted this debt? His begetter, in the enjoyment of sexual pleasure, because the one has enjoyed this pleasure, the other must live, suffer, and die. So this just plainly states how those moments of pleasure during sex actually brings about pain to those produced from this act. Someone's pain is another person's pleasure, and while this is the case for reproduction, it is also evident in our world where we see the rich get rich and the poor get poorer, and all the other examples we see in which someone has gained from another person's loss. Maybe that's the nature of our world. One last point I'll mention from the book comes from page 122, where Coates gets into the idea of asceticism, which is the denial of will or self indulgence. It's a form of self discipline. In this part of the text, Coates details our will to live and how our desire to live causes us suffering, i.e., we didn't get the job we wanted or we're not able to go on the vacation that we dreamed. He mentions in this part of the text that our desire to live, our will, brings about suffering, and it is only through our acknowledgement that we are inevitably suffering that we can be freed from the will to live. The will to live kind of encompasses like our hunger, literally our will to want to eat and all the means that causes or gives us life. So he, in this part of the text, says that we shouldn't indulge ourselves in a life in which we will be suffering no matter what. He states, hence, in most cases, the will must be broken by great personal suffering before its self conquest appears. It is only when suffering assumes the form of pure knowledge, and then this knowledge, as a quieter of the will, produces true resignation, that it can be the path to salvation. Indeed, true salvation, deliverance from life and suffering, cannot even be imagined without complete denial of the will. Till then, everyone is nothing but this will itself. This part in the text gets into great detail about our will to live, and it's super interesting. Instead of asceticism, which would be our self discipline to not indulge in the pleasures of life, some may consider suicide in an attempt to completely destroy the will to live, which Coates references Schopenhauer again, who negates the act of suicide, saying, significantly enough, Schopenhauer rejects suicide as a path to the denial of the will. Talking of suicide in general, he claims that far from denial, it is in fact an affirmation of life. For what suicide involves is not turning against the will to live, but rather expressing some great disappointment or dissatisfaction with life. The people who commit suicide will life. There are so many great points made in this book. This was one book that I seriously could not put down. There were so many wonderful references and well-rounded points that put this idea of anti-natalism in a more cogent perspective. So I seriously recommend you all check this book out yourself as well. I may reread it too and come back and do a review or a deep dive because it is profound. Such a good book, 5 out of 5 stars. Maybe one more point that I'll mention from browsing the web and getting an understanding of this unpopular philosophy. I must say that, like many have said before, antinatalism is an end to a means. And while the concept of being against procreation is not at all widely accepted or even at all understood in our main culture, it logically, to me, and I'm sure many will find, is the answer to all our problems. The thing about this philosophy that is tough is that we do live in a world that promotes, celebrates, and rewards the opposite, those who choose to procreate, leaving the idea of antinatalism very widely detested and rejected by mainstream culture. As an antinatalist, this has been depressing, I must honestly say, because being in proximity to the truth is scary. Challenging other people's worldview can be a risk, but like many other forms of progress, from the civil rights movement, suffrage, all those historical events, there was truth that made people move, speak, act. This argument for antinatalism deserves a voice. It is a means to an end of human suffering. It highlights our true pathology to acquiring a more quality life by being able to focus on those that are here and paying more homage to the people who we already share this world with. Antinatalism challenges us to hold a mirror up to the world and question our widely accepted beliefs. We deserve to make that effort for ourselves and for the future in which we want to see the world, considerate, efficient, and honest, and more. Natalism, or the idea of procreation, is selfish and in and of itself. No one is having children because of the child. People are typically having kids because, it's what the next person is doing, or because it is what the natalist wants. We have to deny ourselves of pleasures, especially when we live already in a world in which, if we allow ourselves to see, we are already provided for. I have my ideas about overpopulation, and I'll just simply say for now, the world is literally already overpopulated, which is why we are being controlled the way we are now in our work, in the laws, and so much more. But that's a video for another day. If you care about the quality of life, if you really dream of a world that is saved and uplifted, you will not reproduce because you understand the logistics and atmosphere of our world. Anti-natalism aims to make sense of the very senselessness in which we participate in every day. It challenges us to truly create change for the greater good. Anti-natalism is a very radical, philanthropic path, giving us a moment to take a step back. And while this idea was difficult for me to come to terms with at first because it completely opposed everything I was told to believe, and it absolutely shattered my sense of reality, but so that I can see the truth in things, I found it was the only way to real salvation. Thank you all so much for watching this video and all the other videos I've made. I'm just in the process of trying to make these videos a little bit more digestible, but also like getting all those points, those important points in so we can like logically like state this argument. Yeah, but I really appreciate you all tuning in, and please like, subscribe and comment on this video so that it can just sort of help in spreading the word out. I'd really appreciate that. Hey guys, I just wanted to let you guys know some notable mentions. Better Never to Have Been by David Benatar. I didn't read that book, but I hear it's pretty good, and it kind of covers antinatalism, you know, with a more original thought. What I've read is Anti-natalism, Rejectionist Philosophy from Buddhism to Benatar, which is some of the text that we covered in this video, so I highly recommend it. It has some really great references, and for me, crystallized the idea of anti-natalism. I'm also reading The Refusal of Work by David Frame. It kind of gets into why we work and just kind of questions the meaning of work and the type of work that we can do. He gets into the personal stories of a couple people that he studied over some time, so I recommend that book. I haven't finished it yet. I think I have about 2 more chapters to go, so hopefully I can get into a deep dive in the book soon. What I'm watching right now, or getting ready to hopefully finish, is 3% on Netflix. It's a really good show. It's kind of like a drama, action-y type of thing. It's like futuristic, it's sci-fi more so. It kind of covers the stories of people wanting to get into the 3% of like this society, so it's really interesting. I highly recommend you watch. So thank you guys so much for tuning into this video, and I will see you in the next one.